Hello, Matthew Harffy here, author of the Bernicia Chronicles, of which For Lord and Land is book number 8 and is out in paperback in January 2022. And for Christmas I got a new USB audio setup so that I can plug in my nice microphones that I've had since I used to sing in a band, but I don't really do much singing anymore, but I've got the microphones and I thought it'd be nice. So I'm using that to record, and I thought it would be a nice test of the audio quality if I recorded a little video of me reading from the prologue of For Lord and Land. Now, the audiobooks of all of my books actually are read and available on Audible and audiobooks.com and all the other places where you'd expect to be able to find audiobooks. And they are read by a fabulous actor and voice actor and general amazing thespian and director as well, Barnaby Edwards. So he reads all of the audiobooks. I'm not trying to do him out of a job, but I thought I would read a little bit just to give you a taste and see how the audio sounds and whether it has any latency. So I'm just going to read the first couple of pages. I'm flicking through to get to the beginning. So right at the beginning here we see the prologue. In the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, 651. Prologue. The riders didn't look dangerous to Leofman at first. He was alerted to their presence by his son, Adwig. The boy had the keen eyes of the young and saw the 4 men on horseback the moment they crested the rise and started their descent into the cleft in the earth that led to the cave. Leofman noticed Adwig staring up the slope, a look of concentration wrinkling his forehead, and he turned to follow his son's gaze. He lowered the heavy pick he had been swinging and took the opportunity to wipe sweat from his brow. The hollow in the earth where they worked was in shadow now, as the sun lowered in the west, but the sky behind the riders was bright. The day had been long and hot, and Leofman had hoped to accomplish more, but he had promised they would be back to the house before dusk. "Pick up the tools and place them in the cart," Leofman said. "But father," whined Adwig, "you said you would show me inside the cave today." "I know I did, son," Leofman replied, his tone distracted, as he shielded his eyes from the bright sky to watch the men urge their horses carefully along the rocky path down the side of the ravine. "But we'll have to do that tomorrow. I promised your mother I would have you home before sundown. Now, help Swigger clear up." He glanced at Swigger, who nodded, and without pause the tall man carried his shovel over to the cart and flung it onto the back with a clatter. It had taken a lot longer to remove the rocks than he had anticipated, and he had begun to wonder at the sense in this course of action. Still, Schulzung, I don't actually know how to pronounce the names, Schulzung had shown him how the samples of rock had yielded the dull, soft metal, and the priest had told him that if there was a lot of the stuff, it would prove much more valuable than grazing sheep and planting barley on the poor soil of the windswept slope of Leofman's land. If he truly could sell the lead for silver, as Schulzung had said, perhaps he could buy some thralls to work the mine. It was obvious that the scale of the work would be too much for Adwig, Swigger, and him alone. He took in the size of the cave's entrance, thinking of the crumbling, overgrown ruins of the stone building at the top of the rise, abandoned no doubt at the same time as the mine. Not for the first time, Leofman wondered how many men had worked the place before it had been forgotten. Adwig and Swigger were busy clearing up now, retrieving the shovels and picks and putting them in the cart. Leofman had berated himself for being overcautious in taking the implements home with him each night. After all, the rusted and broken remnants of past miners' tools had still been strewn about the cave when he had stumbled upon the place. Surely no thief would find the tools in their absence, but seeing the men riding down towards them served to reinforce his decision. Tools could be stolen, and he was not a wealthy man. A shaft of summer sunlight briefly glinted from the lead. From the lead? Briefly glinted from the lead horseman's gear. Leofman squinted to make out more details, and his stomach tightened as he saw the men carried swords. Standing there in his sweat-drenched kirtle, Leofman felt suddenly exposed. And with this, you're seeing why Barnaby Edwards does this for a living, and I do not. "Who are they?" asked Adwig, his high-pitched child's voice piercing the echoing sounds of the horses' hooves in the gully. "I don't know," said Leofman, in a quiet voice. But as they drew closer, he recognised the fat man who rode at the front of the small column. "Swigger," Leofman said, keeping his tone even. "Get Adwig onto the cart. We're leaving." Swigger didn't wait to be told twice. He scooped tiny Adwig up and placed him beside the tools in the bed of the cart. The shaggy brown mare that was tied to the vehicle whinnied in nervous greeting to the approaching horses. Forcing himself to appear relaxed, Leofman stepped forward to meet the riders, interposing himself between them and the cart. They were in the shadows at the foot of the gully now, and he could make them out clearly. They had the hard faces of warriors. Swords and axes hung from their belts. None of them smiled as he raised his hand in welcome. "Boomoth," Leofman said, "what brings you to my lands?" The lead rider pulled gently at his reins, and his sturdy horse halted. The poor beast looked tired, thought Leofman. Boomoth was a massive man, with a round gut and great slabs of muscle over his broad chest. His beard was close cropped, with a clearly defined line beneath it where his neck was shaved. Leofman wondered at the man's vanity to tend to his beard with such precision, as it only served to accentuate his bloated, toad-like jowls. Boomoth made no effort to reply or to dismount. Leofman's disquiet intensified. "What do you want?" he asked, an edge of frustration entering his tone. "It is not what I want," replied Boomoth, offering a thin, almost sad smile. "It is what Sidrak wants you should be concerned with. These are not Sidrak's lands." Boomoth rubbed his fat, bristled chin. "No, they are not," he said, looking about the shadowed ravine, taking in the dark cave mouth and the pile of broken rock before it. His eyes finally rested on the cart. Adwig, wide-eyed and inquisitive, was peering over the edge of at the riders. "Not yet." Before Leofman could respond, the fat man snapped his fingers. "Ashworth, Egbalt, don't hurt the boy." Two of the riders slid from their steeds. It seemed to Leofman that the temperature in the shadowed cleft of the earth had suddenly dropped. He shivered. "What is the meaning of this?" Leofman was angry at himself to hear a tinge of fear in his voice. He wished he'd kept hold of the pick he had been using to split the rocks, but Swigger had retrieved it and put it in the cart. Leofman's hand dropped to his sax. The knife would have to suffice. He tugged the blade from its scabbard where it hung at the rear of his belt, and moved to stand before the two men. It had been years since he had last fought anyone. He might be old, but he had stood in shield walls, and was no coward. And yet, even as he moved, raising himself up to his full, considerable height and drawing his axe, he was uncertain of what would happen next. This was no shield wall. He had no shield, no iron-knit shirt, and only a short-bladed axe with which to defend himself. Long gone were the days when he had stood strong, surrounded by shield brothers. Still, he was not alone. Swigger was certainly no fighter. Leofman knew the lad was loyal. He might be mute, but he was as strong as an ox. Boomoth did not reply to Leofman's question. He looked on with a strange expression, some way between a smile and a frown, the look of a man who is asked to answer a riddle to which he already knows the answer. The two riders who had dismounted moved quickly, passing Leofman before he could intercept them. A third man in a blue warrior coat jumped down nimbly from his mount, and with a fluid motion pulled his sword from its decorated scabbard. The blade gleamed dully in the afternoon shadows. Leofman saw gold and garnets gleaming on its pommel. This was a fine sword, and the man swung it with effortless speed that spoke of great skill as he stepped towards Lefman. This was no ruffian who might be deterred by Lefman's bulk and the sax in his hand. The man's eyes were cold and unflinching, the eyes of a killer. Lefman's mind spun. He did not understand what was happening. Panic rose within him, and he forced it down with an effort. All that matters was keeping his son safe. There was nothing else. "Adwig, run!" Lefman shouted, taking a few steps backwards to draw the blue-coated swordsman towards him and away from the cart. "Swigger, don't let them near Adwig!" He flicked a glance over to his right, and for a moment his heart swelled to see his son leap from the cart and sprint away. Adwig rushed towards the yawning cave mouth, but there was no escape that way. The mine was not deep, and the entrance was still clogged with rubble, and Sidrak's men blocked the path that led out of the ravine. With a pang of fear, Lefman realized there was nowhere for the boy to go. Swigger, silent but ever faithful, pulled a pick from the cart and stepped forward bravely to meet the two men. The nearest of them, a stocky young man with a sharp nose and a long moustache, dragged his sword from its tooled red leather scabbard and sprang forward in one smooth motion. He appeared very sure of himself, clearly not expecting Lefman's wide-shouldered mute bondsman to cause him any problems. But Swigger was no fool. Despite not speaking, he was quick of wits, and much faster than one would expect from his bulk. Sidestepping the swordsman's swinging attack, Swigger allowed the blade to cut harmlessly through the cooling air of the afternoon. His attacker staggered, momentarily off balance. A heartbeat later, he collapsed to the dusty earth as Swigger's pick crushed his skull with a sickening crunch. Lefman gasped. The violence had come so suddenly that his mind struggled to take it in. Blood, obscenely bright, coated the dusty pickhead. For the briefest of moments it seemed that everybody held their breath. Nobody moved. Then Adwig screamed, and, as if the shrill sound of the boy's distress had awoken them, Sidrak's remaining men began to move at the same time. Boomoth shouted something, but Lefman barely heard. His mind was filled with what he had witnessed and the bloodletting that now unfolded before him like a nightmare. He screamed a warning at Swigger, but there was nothing he could do, and Lefman watched in dismay as the second attacker's sword pierced the mute's chest. Swigger grunted, still trying to bring his heavy pick to bear on his opponent. But the bearded warrior grinned as he twisted his blade in Swigger's body. Blood gushed as he wrenched the steel free of his chest. The pick tumbled from Swigger's hand, and he sagged down to his knees. Lefman reeled, but Adwig's cry of alarm brought him to his senses. Spinning back to face the sword-wielding warrior, Lefman raised his sax. His hand trembled. "Ready for me now?" asked the man with a grin. It seemed he had waited for Lefman to face him when he could have cut him down, while he was distracted by his bondsman's death. Lefman did not reply. He could not drag his gaze from the warrior's cold eyes. His blood pounded, and beyond its rushing pulse, his ears were filled with the sounds of his son being snatched up. Adwig beat his tiny fists uselessly against his captor. The boy's cries soon muffled, and Lefman wanted to look, to see what the bastard had done to him. "Don't hurt him," he said, cursing himself for the pleading tone of his voice. As a young man he had fed the raven and the wolf with Mercian and Wallish foemen, and now he was reduced to an old man, begging for pity. He spat. These men would show no mercy. If he was to die here, he would not go easily. They would regret crossing Lefman, son of Hutha. "Don't hurt my son," he repeated, lifting his sax and readying himself to make them pay dearly for what they had done. "Don't worry," the swordsman said, stepping in quickly and batting aside the sax blade with a clang. "We won't." And that's the end of the prologue, and then it's part 1, Shadows from the Past. But read the rest, or listen to the rest if you want. You can buy the book or buy the audiobook with Barnaby Edwards narrating it, as I said before. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed that little taster, and again, I hope you see why there are professionals that do it, like Barnaby Edwards. But I hope this sounded pretty good, and have a great day. And it's just a couple of days before New Year's, so if I put this out before New Year's, or if you see it before New Year's, have a happy New Year and have a wonderful 2022, and stay safe.